In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where 1,000 civilized species have flourished for millennia under the protective umbrella of the Galactic Confederation, there exists a classification system that has remained unchanged for over 10,000 years. Garden worlds, where life blooms in gentle harmony. Industrial worlds, where progress marches forward in measured steps. And then, there are the death worlds, planets so hostile, so unforgiving, that they are marked with crimson warnings in every star chart. Avoid at all costs. No intelligent life possible. For eons, this truth was absolute. Until the day a battered mining ship emerged from hyperspace, its hull scarred by weapons no Confederation species had ever seen, carrying news that would shatter everything the galaxy thought it knew about survival, about strength, and about what it truly means to be alive. The crew spoke of a species that called themselves humans, creatures from Sol 3, a world so deadly that its very existence defied galactic law. A world where the ground itself could split open and swallow cities, where water fell from the sky like liquid bullets, where the atmosphere was poisoned to most known life forms, and where apex predators hunted in packs with the intelligence that bordered on supernatural. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part was that these humans weren't just surviving on their death world, they were thriving. They had built cities that touched the clouds, tamed the very forces that should have destroyed them, and somehow, impossibly, they had looked up at the stars and decided to make them home too. Now, as an ancient enemy that had once driven the Confederation to the very brink of extinction returns from the dark spaces between galaxies, the civilized worlds face a choice that would have been unthinkable just cycles ago. Accept help from the children of a death world, or watch everything they've built turn to ash. This is the story of what happens when the galaxy's greatest fear becomes its only hope. This is the story of humanity's gift to the stars, and the terrible price that comes with accepting it. Ambassador Veltar Kothin had seen many things in her 400 cycles of diplomatic service to the Galactic Confederation, but nothing had prepared her for the sight that greeted her in Observation Deck 7 of the Confederation flagship Harmony's Voice. Through the massive viewport, she watched as what could only be described as controlled chaos unfolded in the space around them. Human ships moved through the void with a grace that defied everything she knew about spacecraft operation. Where Confederation vessels followed careful, predetermined flight paths calculated by their shipboard computers, these alien crafts seemed to dance between asteroids and debris fields with an intuitive fluidity that made her inner ear ache just watching. Their ships were different too, not the elegant, curved designs favored by civilized species, but angular, aggressive things that looked like they had been built for war rather than exploration. Magnificent, aren't they? Veltar turned to find Fleet Admiral Zethkara standing beside her, his blue-scaled hands clasped behind his back as he too watched the human fleet maneuver. The Kytherian officer's usually pristine uniform showed signs of stress, a rare sight for someone of his rank and species. They move like hunters, Veltar observed, her voice carefully neutral despite the unease crawling up her spine. Their ships, the way they position themselves, it's not how civilized beings approach a diplomatic meeting. Admiral Zethkara's laugh held no humor. Civilized. That word has taken on new meaning since we first made contact with them 6 months ago. Did you know that their homeworld has an atmospheric pressure that would crush most of our species before the toxic gases killed them? That their gravity is nearly twice what most worlds can produce? That they evolved alongside predators that could tear through battle-grade armor? Veltar had read the reports, of course. Sol 3, or Earth as the humans called it, was classified as a Class 12 death world, a planetary classification so extreme that most Confederation scientists had argued it was purely theoretical. No life should have been able to evolve on such a hostile rock, much less achieve spaceflight. And yet here they are, she murmured. Here they are indeed. The Admiral's voice carried a weight she had never heard from him before. When our deep space monitoring stations first picked up their radio transmissions 2 years ago, the Science Council declared it impossible. They insisted the signals were some kind of natural phenomenon, because nothing could live on a world like that. What changed their minds? Admiral Zethkara gestured toward the viewport, where a human vessel was casually maneuvering around a piece of debris that would have required a full navigation team to avoid safely. The Vexhai happened. Veltar felt her blood chill at the mention of that name. The Vexhai had been the Confederation's nightmare for millennia, a species of aggressive expansionists who had once controlled a quarter of the galaxy before a coalition of worlds had finally driven them back into the dark spaces between star systems. That had been over 5,000 years ago, and most considered them little more than a cautionary tale told to young spacers. You're saying they've returned? 3 months ago, our border stations in the Kepler sector went dark. When we sent investigation fleets, we found nothing but debris and radiation signatures that matched Vexhai weapon systems. They've been moving steadily inward ever since, destroying everything in their path. The Admiral paused, his scaled features grim. Our war simulations give us a 12% chance of survival if we face them alone. Our weapons are barely effective against their shielding technology. Our ships are too slow to match their tactical speed. And our military doctrine. He shook his head. We've been at peace for so long, Ambassador. We've forgotten how to fight a real war. So you contacted the humans. We had no choice. When our xenobiology teams finally accepted that the impossible signals from Sol 3 were real, the High Council voted to make contact. First contact protocols, diplomatic overtures, the full ceremonial welcome. Do you know what their response was? Veltar waited. Their leader, they call him Secretary General Chun, listened to our entire presentation about galactic law, trade agreements, and cultural exchange protocols. Then, he asked one question. Are you being threatened by something? When we explained about the Vexhai, he said, we'll help. When do we start? The simplicity of it was staggering. No negotiations, no demands for technology transfers or territorial concessions. Just an immediate offer of aid to people they had never met. That was 6 weeks ago, the Admiral continued. It took them exactly 4 days to mobilize a fleet and reach our rendezvous coordinates. For days, Ambassador. It takes us 4 days just to schedule a fleet movement meeting. As if summoned by their conversation, a new contact appeared on the observation deck's holographic display, a human ship approaching their position. This one was larger than the others, more angular and intimidating. Unlike Confederation vessels, which were covered in smooth, flowing lines and artistic flourishes, this ship looked purely functional, every surface designed for maximum efficiency. That would be their flagship, the Indomitable, Admiral Zethkara noted. Their fleet commander wanted to meet with you before the joint operation begins. The ship grew larger as it approached, and Veltar could see details that the long-range sensors had missed. The hull was scarred with what looked like battle damage, but she realized with growing alarm that the marks were too regular, too purposeful. The humans had deliberately left evidence of their battles on their ship's surfaces. Admiral, she said slowly, those marks on their hull. Battle honors, they call them. Each scar represents a different engagement. The more damaged a human ship appears, the more respect it commands in their fleet. This concept was so alien that Veltar struggled to process it. In Confederation culture, battle damage was shameful, a sign that a ship's crew had failed in their duty to avoid conflict. Ships were repaired immediately and restored to pristine condition as quickly as possible. A soft chime announced an incoming communication, and the Admiral activated the main display. The screen flickered to life, revealing a human face for the first time in Veltar's diplomatic career. Fleet Commander Sarah Chun was not what she had expected. The human female was smaller than Confederation citizens, with pale skin marked by several thin scars that her people apparently considered honorable rather than disfiguring. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a practical style, and her eyes were the pale blue of a predator's gaze. Admiral Zethkara, the human said, her voice carrying an accent that the translation software rendered as clipped and efficient. I trust our arrival hasn't caused any disruption to your fleet formations. Not at all, Commander Chun. May I present Ambassador Veltar Kothin, our diplomatic representative. Commander Chin's gaze shifted to Veltar, and she fought the urge to step backward. There was something unsettling about being evaluated by those pale eyes, as if the human was assessing her not as a fellow sapient being, but as a potential threat or asset. Ambassador, Chin said with a slight nod. I understand you have questions about our involvement in your defense against the Vex High. I must admit, Commander, your people's immediate willingness to help is unusual in galactic politics. Most species require extensive negotiations before committing military assets, something that might have been humor flickered across the human's scarred features. Ambassador, on our world, if your neighbor's house is burning down, you don't stop to negotiate the terms of assistance. You grab a bucket and start throwing water. But we're not your neighbors, Commander. Until 6 months ago, you didn't even know we existed. True, Chin acknowledged. But the Vex High aren't just your problem, are they? If they're expanding again, how long before they reach our territory? Better to stop a fire before it spreads than to fight it when it reaches your own door. The logic was sound, but Veltar sensed there was more to the human motivation than simple pragmatism. Commander, may I ask about your people's military experience? Our records indicate that your species has been spacefaring for less than 2 centuries. Spacefaring, yes, Chin agreed. But we've been fighting wars for considerably longer than that. The way she said it sent a chill through Veltar's bones. There was no boasting in the human's tone, no pride, just a simple statement of fact delivered with the casual certainty of someone discussing the weather. Admiral Zethkura cleared his throat. Commander Chin, perhaps you could brief the ambassador on your tactical assessment of the Vex High threat? The human's expression grew serious, and she manipulated something off-screen. The main display shifted to show a 3-dimensional map of local space, with red indicators marking Vex High positions and blue showing Confederation forces. The enemy is using a standard expanding sphere strategy. Chin began, her tone becoming crisp and professional. They're establishing strong points at strategic intervals and using them as bases to launch raids into surrounding systems. Classic territorial expansion doctrine. Our analysts reached similar conclusions, the Admiral confirmed. The difference is in their execution, Chin continued. Vex High ships are faster and more heavily armed than Confederation vessels, but they're following predictable patterns. Their commanders are thinking like conquerors, not warriors. Veltar frowned. I'm not sure I understand the distinction. Commander Chin's smile was sharp and predatory. A conqueror wants to capture territory and resources. A warrior wants to destroy the enemy's ability to fight back. The Vex High are focused on seizing systems and establishing control, which means they're vulnerable to asymmetric warfare. Asymmetric warfare? Admiral Zethkura asked. Fighting in ways your enemy doesn't expect, the human explained. The Vex High expect you to defend your territory conventionally, fleet against fleet, system by system. They're not prepared for raiders to strike their supply lines, or for coordinated attacks on their communication networks, or for enemy forces to simply disappear when confronted and reappear where they're not expected. As Chin spoke, Veltar began to understand why her species had been so quick to offer help. These weren't just warriors. They were predators who had spent their entire evolutionary history learning to hunt things that were bigger, stronger, and more dangerous than themselves. Commander, she said carefully, your people's approach to warfare seems quite sophisticated for a species that has only recently achieved spaceflight. Chin's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. Ambassador, my species has been refining the art of killing things for over 200,000 years. We've fought wars with sticks and stones, with swords and spears, with guns and bombs, with aircraft and tanks. We've developed strategies for every type of terrain, every type of enemy, every type of situation you can imagine. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried the weight of millennia of violence. We've fought wars in frozen wastelands where the air itself could kill you, in jungles so dense that you couldn't see 5 meters in any direction, in deserts where the sun could cook you alive, on islands where the only escape was death, in cities reduced to rubble where every building could hide an enemy. We've learned to fight when outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. We've learned to win when winning seemed impossible. The silence that followed was absolute. Space warfare, Chun concluded quietly, is just another terrain to master. Admiral Zethkura recovered first. Commander, what do you need from us for this joint operation? Detailed intelligence on Vex High capabilities, fleet movements, and strategic objectives. tactical maps of the systems they've taken. And, most importantly, I need your commanders to trust us when we tell them to do things that seem impossible. Impossible how? Beltar asked. Chin's smile returned, and this time it held genuine warmth, which somehow made it even more terrifying. Ambassador, you're about to learn why evolution on a death world produces a very different type of survivor than evolution on safer worlds. We don't just adapt to hostile environments. We turn them into weapons. The communication ended, leaving Veltar and Admiral Zethkara alone on the observation deck. Outside the viewport, human ships continued their deadly dance through space. And, for the first time since the Vexhai had returned, Veltar allowed herself to hope. But it was a hope tempered by a growing understanding that accepting humanity's help would change the Confederation forever. These weren't just allies. They were something entirely new in galactic history. They were children of violence who had somehow learned to channel their destructive nature in service of others. As she watched the human fleet prepare for war, Ambassador Veltar Kothin couldn't shake the feeling that the galaxy was about to discover what happened when you gave apex predators from a death world a cause worth fighting for. The first sign that something was different about human warfare came during the joint tactical briefing aboard the Confederation flagship. Admiral Zethkara had assembled his best commanders in the main conference chamber, a gleaming space designed to project authority and calm deliberation. The holographic display showed the Kepler sector in perfect detail, with enemy positions marked in threatening red. Commander Chin entered the room flanked by two other humans, a tall, dark-skinned man she introduced as Colonel Marcus Webb, and a shorter woman with silver-streaked hair called Captain Lu Ming. Where Confederation officers wore pristine uniforms decorated with symbols of rank and achievement, the humans wore practical clothing marked with the same purposeful scars that decorated their ships. "Thank you for gathering your command staff," Chin said without preamble as she approached the central display. Secondary command structures activate automatically, and ships revert to defensive positions until new orders can be established. Defensive positions, Colonel Webb repeated slowly. What happens if the enemy doesn't cooperate with your defensive strategy? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Commander Chin manipulated the holographic display, zooming in on a section where Vexhai forces had overwhelmed a Confederation defense fleet 3 weeks earlier. "The enemy destroyed your forward elements here," she said, highlighting the battle's progression with cold efficiency. "Your support vessels retreated to defensive positions as protocol required." The Vexhai ignored them completely and proceeded to their actual objective, the colony worlds you were trying to protect. Admiral Zethkara felt heat rising in his throat, embarrassment mixed with frustration. "Our tactics have served the Confederation well for thousands of years." "Against whom?" Captain Lu asked quietly. "When was the last time your forces faced an enemy that actually wanted to destroy you rather than negotiate with you?" The silence that followed was telling. The Confederation had enjoyed such a long period of peace that most of their conflicts had been diplomatic disputes over trade routes or territorial boundaries. Actual warfare was something that happened in history texts, not in living memory. "The Vexhai aren't trying to negotiate," Commander Chin continued. "They're not interested in capturing your ships intact or preserving infrastructure for future use. They want to eliminate potential threats to their expansion, which means they're perfectly willing to sacrifice their own forces if it means destroying yours." She manipulated the display again, showing projected Vexhai movements into Confederation space. The red markers spread like a viral infection, consuming system after system. "Their next target is the Centauri Junction," Chin announced. "It's a strategic choke point that controls access to 12 different star systems. If they take it, they cut off retreat routes for half your remaining fleet, gain staging areas for attacks deeper into your territory." Captain Mordun studied the projection with growing unease. "Our analysis suggests they'll need at least 6 weeks to reach the junction. That gives us time to reinforce the system defenses." "They'll be there in 4 days," Colonel Webb said flatly. "Impossible. Their current position is a deception," Commander Chin interrupted. "The forces you've been tracking are a screening element. Their main attack fleet has been using the asteroid fields in the Vega Nebula to mask their movement. They'll hit the junction before your reinforcements can arrive." The Confederation officers exchanged alarmed glances. Admiral Zethkara leaned forward. How can you be certain of this? Captain Lu's smile was sharp. Because it's what we would do. When you're facing a stronger enemy, you don't give them time to prepare. You hit them when, and where they least expect it. Our scouts have been monitoring all approaches to the junction. Fleet Captain Mordun insisted. There's no way a fleet could approach undetected. Your scouts are looking for traditional ship formations, Colonel Webb explained with the patience of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student. Vex-High vessels are smaller and more maneuverable than yours. They can travel in dispersed groups and assemble at the last moment, a tactic that makes them nearly invisible to conventional sensors. Commander Chen touched a control, and the display shifted to show real-time sensor data from the Vega Nebula. At first glance, it looked empty, just the usual electromagnetic interference from stellar debris. But, as she adjusted the filters, faint signatures began to appear. Thermal anomalies consistent with engine heat, she pointed out. Gravitational disturbances that suggest mass concentrations where there shouldn't be any. Communication bursts disguised as natural stellar radiation. The evidence was subtle but undeniable. A massive enemy fleet was hiding in plain sight, preparing to strike at the heart of Confederation space. How did you detect this when our sensors missed it? Admiral Zethkara demanded. Because we know how to hide from advanced sensors ourselves, Captain Lu replied. On Earth, we spent centuries learning to hunt enemies who could hear us coming from kilometers away, see in the dark, smell our tracks from days before. Camouflage and concealment aren't just tactical tools for us, they're survival instincts. Colonel Webb activated his own portable display, showing tactical formations that made the Confederation officers visibly uncomfortable. Instead of the neat, orderly arrangements they were used to, human battle groups were scattered across vast distances, with no apparent pattern or structure. This is how we'll intercept them, he announced. Small units positioned at key gravitational anchor points throughout the nebula. When the Vex-High fleet assembles for their attack run, we'll be waiting inside their formation. Inside their formation? Captain Mordun's voice pitched higher with alarm. That's suicide. You'll be surrounded and outnumbered. Commander Chen's expression didn't change. Only if you think like prey instead of like predators. The Vex-High are expecting to engage a defensive fleet that will try to protect fixed positions. They're not prepared for attackers who appear among them without warning. She manipulated the display to show attack vectors that seemed to defy tactical logic. Human ships would approach the Vex-High fleet from multiple directions simultaneously, striking at command vessels and supply ships while avoiding direct confrontation with heavily armed warships. You're planning to attack them during their attack? Admiral Zethkara struggled to comprehend the audacity of the strategy. We're planning to turn their attack against them, Colonel Webb corrected. While they're focused on reaching the junction, we'll be destroying their ability to sustain the assault. No fuel ships, no ammunition carriers, no communication relays, just scattered groups of warships with no supplies and no coordination. Captain Lu pulled up another display showing estimated battle casualties. The numbers made several Confederation officers step back in horror. Human losses were projected at over 30%, a figure that would be considered catastrophic by any civilized military standard. You're willing to sacrifice a third of your fleet? Fleet Captain Mordun whispered. We're willing to do whatever it takes to stop them, Captain Lu replied without hesitation. Dead heroes are still heroes. Dead enemies are just dead. The casual way she discussed such massive casualties sent chills through the room. These humans weren't just trained warriors. They were fanatics who embraced destruction as a tool rather than fearing it as a failure. What about civilian casualties? Admiral Zethkara asked, dreading the answer. Commander Chen's expression hardened. There won't be any. That's the point. Every human who dies in this operation is one less Vex-High soldier who lives to threaten innocent people. Every ship we lose is 10 enemy vessels that won't be available for their next attack. She touched the display again, showing long-term projections. With the human strategy, Vex-High expansion would be halted at the cost of significant Allied casualties. With conventional Confederation tactics, the enemy would continue advancing until they reached the core worlds where billions of civilians lived. The math is simple, Colonel Webb said bluntly. We lose some people now, or everyone loses everything later. The room fell silent as the Confederation officers struggled to process this alien approach to warfare. In their culture, military operations were conducted with minimal risk to personnel. Battles were careful, calculated affairs where victory was measured in territory gained with minimal loss of life. Commander Chun, Admiral Zethkara said slowly, "Your people's willingness to sacrifice themselves is admirable. But surely there must be a way to achieve victory without such devastating losses." Commander Chun studied him for a long moment before responding. "Admiral, let me tell you something about my homeworld. Earth has been trying to kill everything that lives on it for 4 billion years. Ice ages that froze entire continents. Volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun. Asteroid impacts that eliminated 90% of all life. Plagues that swept across the globe in months." She paused, and her voice took on a quality that made the alien officers lean forward despite their fear. "Every single one of my ancestors survived something that should have killed them. They survived by being tougher, smarter, and more vicious than everything trying to destroy them. They survived by making hard choices that gentler species couldn't make. They survived by understanding that sometimes the only way to save what you love is to pay a price that would break your heart." Captain Lu stepped forward. "The difference between us and the HFY isn't technology or numbers. It's that they're fighting to conquer, and we're fighting to save. They want to rule the galaxy. We just want to make sure there's still a galaxy left to rule." Colonel Webb activated a new display showing detailed human ship schematics. Unlike Confederation vessels with their elegant curves and artistic flourishes, human warships were angular, brutal things covered in weapon ports and armor plating. "Every human ship is designed to keep fighting even after it's been crippled," he explained. "We build redundant systems, backup power sources, and emergency protocols that let a vessel continue engaging the enemy even if it's been cut in half." The implications were staggering. While Confederation ships retreated for repairs after taking moderate damage, human vessels would continue fighting until they were literally torn apart. "Your tactics require a level of commitment that I'm not sure our crews can match," Admiral Zethkara admitted. Commander Chen nodded slowly. "That's why we're not asking them to. Human ships will handle the close engagement work. Your forces will provide support, backup, and rescue operations. We'll take the risks because we're good at taking risks. You handle the coordination and logistics because you're good at coordination and logistics." It was a division of labor that played to each species' strengths while acknowledging their limitations. The humans would serve as the blade, sharp, deadly, and willing to be broken in service of the cause. The Confederation would serve as the handle, stable, reliable, and essential for directing that deadly force where it needed to go. "There's one more thing," Captain Lu said as the briefing began to wind down. "When this battle starts, you're going to see things that will horrify you. You're going to watch human ships deliberately ram enemy vessels. You're going to see our fighters continue attacking even after their life support fails. You're going to witness levels of violence that will seem senseless and wasteful." She looked each Confederation officer in the eye. "Remember that we're not doing it because we enjoy it. We're doing it because someone has to, and we're the ones best equipped to do it. Every terrible thing you see us do is something the HFY won't be able to do to your people." As the briefing concluded and the officers began filing out, Admiral Zethkara remained behind with Commander Chen. The weight of what was coming pressed down on him like a physical force. "Commander," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something directly. Are your people suicidal?" Chen's laugh held no humor. "Admiral, if we were suicidal, we would have died out on our death world millions of years ago. We're not trying to get ourselves killed. We're trying to make sure that when the fighting stops, the right people are still alive." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "The difference between suicide and sacrifice, Admiral, is that sacrifice serves a purpose greater than yourself. My people learned that lesson in the ashes of burning cities and on beaches soaked with blood. We learned it in frozen mountains and burning deserts. We learned it from every disaster that tried to wipe us out and every enemy that tried to break us." Her pale blue eyes met his across the empty briefing room. "We learned that sometimes the only way to win is to be willing to lose everything in the attempt. The HFY are about to learn that lesson too. Lieutenant Commander Torres had never expected to die in the cold vacuum between stars. But, as alarms screamed throughout the bridge of the UES Defiant, she found herself oddly at peace with the prospect. Through the main view screen, she could see Vex-High battlecruisers emerging from the swirling gas clouds of the Vega Nebula like prehistoric monsters rising from primordial depths. Enemy fleet is assembling as predicted, reported Sensor Operator Park, her voice steady despite the fact that they were about to engage a force 10 times their size. Count is, Christ, ma'am, 230 vessels, and climbing. Torres allowed herself a grim smile. The humans had been right about Vex-High tactics. The enemy had concentrated their entire strike force for what they assumed would be a devastating blow against the Centauri Junction. What they hadn't anticipated was finding 37 human ships waiting inside their formation like wolves hidden among sheep. Signal the fleet, Torres commanded. Execute Razor Protocol on my mark. Across the nebula, human vessels that had been drifting silently among asteroids and debris suddenly came alive. Unlike the massive, elegant ships favored by Confederation species, human warships were compact, angular predators built for close-quarters combat. The Defiant herself was barely a quarter the size of the smallest Vex-High cruiser, but she packed enough firepower to crack a moon. On her personal display, Torres watched the tactical situation develop exactly as Commander Chun had predicted. The Vex-High fleet was arranging itself into a traditional assault formation. Heavy battleships in the center, support vessels on the flanks, with fighter screens providing perimeter security. It was a textbook maneuver that would have been devastatingly effective against conventional defenders. Ma'am, called Communications Officer Zhang, receiving transmission from Confederation forces. Admiral Zeth Kara is requesting our status. Tell the Admiral that the Fox is in the henhouse, Torres replied. All units, mark your targets. Remember, we're not here to win a fair fight. We're here to make sure there isn't one. The Vex-High ships were impressive specimens of military engineering. Their hulls gleamed with an iridescent armor that could deflect energy weapons, and their weapons arrays bristled with enough firepower to sterilize planets. Each vessel was crewed by hundreds of warrior-caste Vex-High, members of a species that had conquered half the galaxy through superior technology and ruthless efficiency. What they lacked was experience fighting an enemy that didn't play by civilized rules. Target the command vessels first, Torres instructed her weapons officer, Lieutenant Okafor. Multiple simultaneous strikes to overwhelm their defensive systems. Make it look like we have more ships than we actually do. The first human attack came without warning. Throughout the Vex-High formation, torpedo salvos erupted from seemingly empty space as human ships dropped their camouflage fields and fired point-blank into enemy command centers. The alien vessels, designed to engage targets at extreme range, were helpless against attackers that appeared among them without warning. 3 Vex-High command cruisers disappeared in brilliant explosions before their crews even realized they were under attack. The enemy formation, which had been moving with clockwork precision moments before, suddenly became a swirling mass of confusion as subordinate vessels tried to determine where orders should come from. Enemy fighters moving to intercept, Park reported. Estimate 400 small craft inbound. Torres felt her heartbeat quicken with anticipation rather than fear. This was what human pilots had trained for, close-quarters combat against overwhelming odds where superior skill and desperation could overcome technological disadvantage. Launch all fighters, she commanded. Tell Squadron Leader Martinez that the hunting is open. Through the view screen, she watched as human fighter craft poured out of concealed launch bays throughout the nebula. Where Confederation fighters were sleek, sophisticated machines designed for defensive patrols, human fighters were compact death traps built around the largest engines and weapon systems that could fit in a small package. The dogfight that erupted between human and Vex-High fighters was unlike anything seen in galactic warfare for millennia. Confederation pilots flew with careful precision, following established protocols and maintaining formation discipline. Human pilots flew like their ancestors had fought, with wild improvisation, impossible courage, and a complete disregard for their own safety. Vex-High fighters are fast and well-armed, Lieutenant Okafor observed as explosions lit up the space around them. But They're flying like they expect their enemies to be predictable. Torres nodded. That was exactly the tactical advantage Commander Chun had identified. The Vexhai had spent 5,000 years fighting civilized species that valued preservation of life above military success. They had no experience with opponents who were willing to trade their lives for strategic advantage. Squadron Leader Martinez's voice crackled over the communication system, calm and professional despite the chaos surrounding his fighter wing. Control, this is Reaper Lead. Enemy pilots are skilled, but cautious. They break off attacks when they take damage instead of pressing advantages. Recommend aggressive close engagement tactics. Copy that, Reaper Lead. Execute at your discretion. What followed was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Human fighters, outnumbered 4-1, began using tactics that would have horrified Confederation strategists. They deliberately flew their damaged craft into enemy formations, using their own destruction as weapons. They coordinated ramming attacks that sacrificed individual pilots to eliminate multiple enemy fighters. They turned their fighters into guided missiles when conventional ammunition ran out. The Vexhai, despite their technological superiority, found themselves losing the engagement. Their pilots, trained in conventional combat doctrines, couldn't adapt quickly enough to opponents who treated death as just another tactical option. Enemy capital ships are beginning to respond, Park reported. Massive energy signatures detected. They're targeting our fighter squadrons. Torres watched as brilliant beams of energy lanced through space toward the human fighters. Several small craft vanished instantly, vaporized by weapons designed to destroy much larger vessels. But for every human fighter that died, the Vexhai paid a price in confusion, disrupted formations, and damaged support systems. Signal the fleet, Torres commanded. Begin Phase 2. Target enemy logistics vessels. This was the heart of the human strategy. While Vexhai commanders focused on the dramatic fighter combat, human capital ships were systematically destroying the supply vessels, communication relays, and command infrastructure that kept the enemy fleet functioning. The Defiant herself locked onto a massive Vexhai supply ship, a vessel longer than 3 human destroyers, and carrying enough ammunition and fuel to sustain the entire enemy fleet for weeks. Unlike the heavily armed warships, supply vessels were only lightly defended, making them perfect targets for the human tactic of close-range ambush attacks. Take us in fast and dirty, Torres ordered her helmsman, Commander Petrov. Get us close enough to ram if we have to. The Defiant accelerated toward the enemy supply ship with reckless abandon, weaving between larger vessels and ignoring the defensive fire that filled space around them. To observers from civilized species, it would have looked like a suicide run. To the human crew, it was Tuesday. Weapons range in 30 seconds, Lieutenant Okafor announced. Enemy vessel is turning to present smaller target profile. Too little, too late, Torres muttered. The Vexhai crew was following standard defensive protocols, but those protocols assumed an attacker would engage from long range where defensive systems could be effective. At point-blank range, all the armor in the galaxy wouldn't help. The Defiant unleashed her full arsenal at a distance that would have been considered suicidal in any conventional engagement. Kinetic penetrators punched through the supply ship's hull like bullets through paper. Energy beams that normally dispersed across kilometers of space maintained their coherence long enough to slice the enemy vessel in half. Missile warheads detonated directly against the target's hull, sending massive explosions rippling through the interior. The supply ship broke apart in a spectacular display of secondary explosions as stored ammunition cooked off in chain reactions. The destruction was so complete that debris from the explosion damaged 2 nearby Vexhai cruisers. Target destroyed, Lieutenant Okafor reported with satisfaction. Enemy fleet just lost approximately 40% of their ammunition reserves. Across the battlefield, similar scenes were playing out as human ships struck at the logistical foundation of the Vexhai assault force. Communication relays vanished in brilliant flashes. Fuel tankers exploded in expanding spheres of plasma. Medical ships carrying replacement crews were torn apart by weapons fire. Confederation forces are engaging, Park announced. Admiral Zethkara's fleet is hitting the enemy flanks. On the tactical display, Torres could see blue markers representing Confederation vessels as they began their own attack. Unlike the chaotic human assault, the Allied fleet moved with careful precision, following established battle doctrines and maintaining formation integrity. The contrast was striking. Human ships darted through space like attacking sharks, appearing without warning to strike at critical targets before vanishing back into the nebula's concealment. Confederation vessels advanced methodically, their weapons creating coordinated patterns of fire that carved through enemy formations with mathematical precision. Together, the two fleets were devastating the Vex-High assault force. The enemy, expecting to face either human savagery or Confederation precision, was unprepared for opponents who combined both approaches. Enemy commanders are adapting, Commander Petrov observed from the helm station. They're consolidating their remaining forces into defensive formations. Torres nodded. The Vex-High were competent military professionals, and they were beginning to understand the nature of the threat they faced. But understanding and countering were two different things. Signal all units, she commanded. Execute Phase 3. Time to show them what desperation really looks like. Phase 3 was the most audacious part of the human battle plan. Instead of withdrawing or consolidating their forces, the human fleet would launch a direct assault on the enemy command ship, a massive dreadnought that served as the focal point for Vex-High fleet coordination. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Zhang said hesitantly, "the enemy flagship is surrounded by defensive screens. It would take our entire remaining fleet to penetrate their protection." "Then, that's exactly what we'll do," Torres replied without hesitation. "Set course for the enemy command ship. Maximum acceleration." What followed was the kind of attack that military historians would study for centuries, if anyone survived to write the history. 23 human ships, battered and running low on ammunition, launched themselves directly at the heart of the enemy formation. They came not as a coordinated fleet, but as individual predators striking from multiple angles simultaneously. The Vex-High defensive response was immediate and overwhelming. Energy beams and missile salvos filled space with deadly light as hundreds of weapons targeted the incoming human ships. The smaller human vessels began dying almost immediately, but they kept coming. The UES Valiant took a direct hit from a particle beam that vaporized her entire aft section, but her remaining crew kept the ship on course long enough to ram a Vex-High destroyer. The UES Intrepid lost life support and artificial gravity, but her crew continued manning their weapons in hard vacuum until the ship's magazine exploded and took an enemy cruiser with it. Hull breach on Deck 7. Damage control reported as the Defiant shuddered under enemy fire. "We've lost main propulsion." Torres felt the deck buck beneath her feet as another enemy salvo struck home. Around her, the bridge crew worked with calm efficiency despite the fact that they were probably all going to die in the next few minutes. "Emergency propulsion only," she ordered. "Helm, maintain course toward the enemy flagship." Through the smoke and sparks filling the bridge, Torres could see their target growing larger on the main screen. The Vex-High command ship was a massive construction, bristling with weapons and protected by energy shields that could deflect almost any attack. Almost any attack. "Weapons," Torres called to Lieutenant Okafor. "Arm the Prometheus device." A shocked silence fell over the bridge. The Prometheus device was humanity's most closely guarded secret, a weapon so devastating that its existence was known only to the highest levels of command. It had never been used in actual combat, but simulations suggested it could crack a planet's crust. "Ma'am," Okafor said quietly, "arming the Prometheus device will require manual activation. The explosion will. There won't be time to evacuate." Torres looked around the bridge at her crew, young men and women who had volunteered to serve aboard a ship that was expected to be destroyed in its first major engagement. They were scared, she could see it in their eyes, but they weren't backing down. "I know," she said simply. "But if we don't stop that command ship, the Vex-High will regroup and launch another attack. More ships, more planets, more innocent people who deserve to live in peace." She touched the communication controls, opening a channel to the surviving human fleet. "All vessels, this is Defiant. We're going to punch a hole in their defenses. When we do, I want every remaining ship to pour through and finish this fight." The response came immediately from ships throughout the formation. "Copy that, Defiant. It's been an honor." Torres closed the channel and looked at her crew one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been my privilege to serve with you. Let's show the galaxy what humans are capable of. The Defiant accelerated toward the enemy flagship, her damaged hull screaming through space as Vex-High weapons tore her apart piece by piece. But she kept coming, kept flying, kept fighting until the moment her bow touched the enemy's shields. When the Prometheus device detonated, the explosion was visible from 3 star systems away. The aftermath of the Battle of Vega Nebula left Admiral Zethkura staring at sensor readings that defied everything he thought he knew about warfare. Where the massive Vex-High fleet had been assembling just hours before, only debris fields and radiation signatures remained. Of the 230 enemy vessels that had entered the system, fewer than 40 had escaped, and those were badly damaged ships fleeing in complete disarray. But the victory had come at a terrible cost. Final casualty report from the human fleet, his communications officer announced, her voice subdued. Ambassador Veltar, who had insisted on remaining aboard the flagship during the battle, visibly flinched at the numbers. 37 human ships had entered the engagement. 9 had survived, and most of those were barely space-worthy. The human casualty rate was over 70%, a figure that would have been considered a catastrophic defeat by any civilized military standard. Admiral, Veltar said quietly, how can they call this a victory? They've lost almost their entire fleet. Admiral Zethkura didn't answer immediately. Instead, he activated the long-range sensors and showed her the tactical display. The Vex-High invasion force that had been systematically conquering Confederation worlds for months had been completely shattered. Their supply lines were destroyed, their command structure eliminated, and their remaining forces scattered across a dozen different systems. Because, Ambassador, he said slowly, they didn't measure victory by how many of their own people survived. They measured it by how many of the enemy they stopped. On the main view screen, one of the surviving human vessels limped toward their position. The U.S. Perseverance had lost her main engines, most of her armor plating, and apparently half her crew, but she was still flying, still fighting, if necessary. A communication request came through, and Admiral Zethkura accepted it immediately. Commander Chen appeared on the screen, and the Admiral was shocked by her appearance. The human's face was pale with exhaustion, marked by fresh burns and what looked like shrapnel wounds. Behind her, the bridge of her ship was a chaotic mess of exposed cables, emergency lighting, and jury-rigged repairs. Admiral Zethkura, Chen said, her voice hoarse but steady. I'm transmitting our tactical assessment to your command staff. The immediate Vex-High threat has been neutralized, but we need to discuss long-term security arrangements. Commander, the Admiral replied, struggling to find the right words. Your people sacrificed today. There are no words adequate to express our gratitude. Something flickered across Chen's scarred features, surprise, perhaps, or discomfort with the praise. Admiral, with respect, we didn't do this for gratitude. We did it because it needed to be done. Still, the losses your fleet sustained were acceptable given the strategic objectives achieved, Chen interrupted. Every person who died today knew the risks when they volunteered for this mission. They chose to be here because they understood that sometimes the price of peace is paid in blood. Ambassador Veltar leaned forward. Commander, surely your people must feel some grief for their fallen comrades? Commander Chen's expression hardened, and, for a moment, the mask of professional composure slipped. Ambassador, we grieve for every person we lost today. We'll grieve for them for the rest of our lives. But we also know that their deaths meant something. They died so that billions of innocent people could continue living. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a weight that seemed to press against the souls of everyone listening. On my homeworld, we have a saying, all gave some gave all. Today, some of our people gave everything they had to give. Tomorrow, the rest of us will continue their work. The communication ended, leaving Admiral Zethkura and Ambassador Veltar alone with the implications of what they had witnessed. These humans weren't just skilled warriors. They were a species that had somehow learned to transform their natural aggression into a form of sacrificial protection. Admiral, Veltar said slowly, I think I'm beginning to understand why their homeworld is classified as a death world. The hostile environment, No, she replied, shaking her head. It's not the dangerous wildlife or the extreme climate that makes Earth a death world. It's that it produced a species capable of this level of violence in service of others. They're not dangerous because they're savage. They're dangerous because they're civilized predators. Over the following days, as damage reports came in and rescue operations continued, the true scope of human sacrifice became clear. The battle hadn't just been won through superior tactics or advanced technology. It had been won through the willingness of individual humans to die for people they had never met. Fighter pilot Maria Santos had continued attacking enemy targets even after her life support failed, manually piloting her craft through hard vacuum until she finally succumbed to oxygen deprivation. Engineer First Class David Kim had stayed at his post to maintain artificial gravity on an evacuating transport, ensuring that wounded crew members could reach the escape pods before the ship's reactor went critical. Medical Officer Sarah Okonkwo had refused evacuation from a damaged vessel, instead treating wounded personnel until the ship's hull finally gave way. The stories went on and on, hundreds of individual acts of heroism that had collectively broken the back of the Vex-High invasion force. But what struck Admiral Zethkara most profoundly wasn't the scale of the sacrifice, but how matter-of-factly the surviving humans discussed it. "It's what we do," Captain Lu Ming explained during the post-battle briefing. Her own ship, the U.S. Determination, had taken damage that would have required months of repair work, but her crew had managed to get the engines running again through sheer stubborn determination. When someone needs help, you help them. When someone threatens innocent people, you stop them. It doesn't matter what it costs you personally. Fleet Captain Mordun, who had fought alongside human forces during the battle, shook his head in amazement. "Captain, your people's courage is beyond question, but surely you must have some instinct for self-preservation." Captain Lu's smile was grim. "Of course we do. Self-preservation is what kept our species alive long enough to develop technology and reach the stars. But we also learned that sometimes the best way to preserve yourself is to eliminate the threats facing your community." She activated a portable display showing casualty projections. "If we had fought this battle using conventional tactics, trying to minimize our own losses while gradually wearing down the enemy, the Vex-High would have eventually broken through. Maybe not today, maybe not next month, but eventually. And when they did, millions of civilians would have died." The mathematical reality was stark. By accepting massive casualties in a single decisive engagement, the human fleet had prevented far greater losses among the civilian populations they were protecting. But how do you convince your people to accept such risks? Admiral Zethkara asked. "What kind of training produces soldiers willing to die for strangers?" Captain Lu's expression grew thoughtful. "Admiral, I don't think you understand. We don't train people to die for strangers. We train them to live for something bigger than themselves." She touched a control, and the display showed images from Earth, cities full of people going about their daily lives, children playing in parks, families gathered around dinner tables. Every human who served in this fleet volunteered knowing they might not come home. But they also knew that their sacrifice might mean that scenes like these could continue happening on worlds they'll never visit, among species they'll never meet. Colonel Webb, whose own ship had been among the vessels destroyed in the final assault, nodded from his position at the briefing table. Despite being technically dead according to his ship's records, he had somehow managed to survive in an escape pod and had been recovered by Confederation rescue teams. "The thing most species don't understand about humans," he said quietly, "is that we don't see death as the worst thing that can happen to us. The worst thing that can happen to us is living with the knowledge that we could have prevented suffering and chose not to act." Ambassador Veltar felt a chill run down her spine. "Colonel, what you're describing sounds almost like a form of warrior religion." "Maybe it is," Webb acknowledged. "But, if so, it's a religion that teaches us to protect those who cannot protect themselves, to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them, and to ensure that the price of peace is never paid by people who didn't choose to fight." The briefing continued for several more hours, covering strategic assessments, reconstruction plans, and long-term security arrangements. But Admiral Zethkara found his attention drifting to the implications of what he was learning about humanity. These weren't just allies. They were guardians, a species that had somehow evolved beyond simple survival and had developed a collective sense of responsibility that extended far beyond their own borders. They had taken on the role of protectors not because anyone asked them to, but because their fundamental nature drove them to defend the defenseless. As the meeting concluded and the various officers began filing out, Commander Chen approached Admiral Zethkara with a data pad in her hand. "Admiral," she said, "I wanted to discuss our next steps. Intelligence suggests that the Vexhai will regroup and attempt another invasion within 6 months. We need to be ready for them." The Admiral looked at the data pad with growing alarm. Chun was outlining plans for expanding the human fleet, establishing forward operating bases, and conducting deep strike operations into Vexhai territory. It was an aggressive strategy that would require substantial resources and risk even more human lives. "Commander," he said carefully, "your people have already given more than anyone could reasonably ask. Surely the Confederation can handle our own defense from this point forward." Chen's pale blue eyes met his, and he saw something in them that made him understand why predators on Earth had learned to fear the human gaze. "Admiral," she said quietly, "the Vexhai aren't just your problem anymore. They've proven that they're willing to commit genocide to achieve their expansion goals. As long as they exist as an organized military force, they're a threat to every peaceful species in the galaxy." She paused, and her voice took on the quality of an oath being sworn. "My people didn't come here just to win one battle. We came here to end this war, and we will end it, no matter what it costs us." As she walked away, Admiral Zethkara realized that the galaxy had fundamentally changed in ways that no one fully understood yet. Humanity hadn't just offered military assistance. They had appointed themselves as permanent guardians of galactic peace. The question that would keep him awake for months to come was simple. What happened to the galaxy when a species of apex predators decided that their purpose was to protect everyone else? Ambassador Veltar joined him at the observation window, where they could see human ships conducting rescue operations among the debris fields. Even now, hours after the battle had ended, human crews were risking their lives to search for survivors. Not just their own people, but Confederation personnel and even captured Vexhai, who might provide intelligence. "Admiral," she said softly, "I think I understand now why the humans were so quick to offer help when we first contacted them." "Oh, they weren't being altruistic," she explained. "They were being practical. From their perspective, any threat to galactic stability is a threat to the innocent people they've appointed themselves to protect. Helping us wasn't charity, it was self-defense by proxy." Admiral Zethkara nodded slowly. It was a disturbing thought, but probably an accurate one. Humanity had looked at the galaxy's political situation and had made a strategic decision to intervene before threats could grow large enough to endanger civilian populations. "The question," he said quietly, "is whether the rest of the galaxy is ready for that kind of protection." Through the viewport, they watched as human rescue teams continued their work, risking their lives to save people who were complete strangers. It was a scene that would be repeated throughout the galaxy in the months and years to come, as humanity gradually took on the role of guardian species, whether anyone asked them to or not. The age of human protection had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same. 6 months after the Battle of Vega Nebula, Ambassador Veltar Kothan stood in the observation lounge of the newest addition to the Confederation fleet, the US Memorial, a joint human Confederation vessel that served as both a symbol of alliance and a floating monument to those who had died defending galactic peace. Through the massive viewport, she watched something that would have been unthinkable just a year ago: human and Confederation crews working side by side to construct the first joint military academy. The changes hadn't come easily. The initial proposals for permanent human military presence in Confederation space had triggered heated debates in the Senate chambers of a dozen worlds. Species that had enjoyed millennia of relative peace struggled to accept that their safety now depended on warriors from a death world. "They're afraid of us," Commander Chen had observed during one particularly contentious diplomatic session. And honestly, they should be. We're the most dangerous species they've ever encountered. But that fear had gradually given way to something more complex as the galaxy began to understand what humanity offered and what they demanded in return. The door chimed, and Veltar turned to see Admiral Sarah Chun entering the lounge. The human officer looked older than she had 6 months ago, her face marked by the strain of transitioning from fleet commander to the galaxy's first human diplomatic representative. The scars on her face had faded but not disappeared, serving as permanent reminders of the price her species was willing to pay. Ambassador, Chin said, settling into the chair across from her. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I know the Senate sessions have been challenging lately. That was diplomatic understatement. The Galactic Senate had been in almost continuous session for weeks, debating the implications of the human question. What to do about a species that had unilaterally decided to serve as the galaxy's protectors. Admiral, Veltar replied. I think it's time we address the concerns that some member species have raised about human intentions. Chin's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her pale blue eyes. You mean the accusations that we're planning to conquer the galaxy through military occupation? Among others, yes. The human leader was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the construction activity in the space beyond. Human engineering crews were working alongside Confederation technicians to build structures that represented a new type of military installation. Bases designed not for conquest or territorial control, but for rapid response to threats anywhere in known space. Ambassador, Chin said finally, let me tell you about my homeworld. Earth has been inhabited by humans for over 200,000 years. In that time, we've fought more wars than most species can imagine. We've conquered, we've been conquered, we've built empires, and watched them fall. She turned to face Veltar directly. Do you know what we learned from all of that violence and destruction? We learned that conquest is ultimately pointless. You can take someone's territory, steal their resources, even enslave their people, but you can't conquer an idea. You can't conquer hope, or love, or the determination to be free. Veltar leaned forward. Then, what do you want from the galaxy? Chin's smile was sad but genuine. We want to make sure that the people who value peace get to keep it. We want to ensure that species who have never known war don't have to learn about it the hard way. We want to create a galaxy where parents don't have to worry about their children being murdered by raiders, where scientists can pursue knowledge without fear of invasion, where artists can create beauty without wondering if it will be destroyed tomorrow. And you believe that requires a permanent military presence. Ambassador, let me ask you something. If your child was threatened by a predator, would you negotiate with it, or would you eliminate it? The question hit Veltar like a physical blow. In Confederation culture, the protection of young was considered the highest moral imperative, superseding all other considerations, including personal safety. I would eliminate the threat, she admitted. So would we, Chin replied. The difference is that we consider every innocent person in the galaxy to be under our protection. We've adopted the galaxy as our family, whether it asked us to or not. The implications were staggering. Humanity wasn't seeking conquest or domination, they were offering adoption. They wanted to extend their protective instincts to every peaceful species in known space. But what about species that don't want human protection? Veltar asked. What about the independence and sovereignty that the Confederation was founded to preserve? Chin activated a portable display showing the current galactic map. Red zones marked areas where Vexi remnants were still active. Yellow indicated regions where other hostile species were expanding, and green showed the growing areas under joint Human Confederation protection. Any species that wants to handle their own defense is welcome to do so, Chin said simply. We're not trying to force our protection on anyone, but we will respond when innocent people call for help, and we will not allow genocidal regimes to threaten peaceful populations. She touched a control, and the display zoomed in on a particular sector. 3 weeks ago, the Talvarian Republic requested assistance dealing with raiders from the Korax Syndicate. We responded with a small task force that eliminated the immediate threat and established patrol routes to prevent future attacks. I read that report, Veltar said. Your forces completely destroyed the Korax fleet. Yes, Chin acknowledged without remorse. The Korax Syndicate had been enslaving Talvarian civilians and selling them to off-world buyers. When we offered them the opportunity to cease their operations and return their captives, they responded by threatening to execute their prisoners. The human's expression grew cold. We don't negotiate with slavers, Ambassador. We eliminate them. Veltar felt the familiar chill that seemed to accompany discussions of human military philosophy. These people approached violence with a casual certainty that was both terrifying and oddly reassuring. Admiral, there are those in the Senate who argue that humanity's methods are too extreme for civilized space. They point to incidents like the Korax action as evidence that your people can't be trusted with galactic security. Chen's laugh held no humor. Ambassador, the same senators who criticize our methods haven't volunteered to deal with these threats themselves. It's easy to call us extreme when you've never had to face the kind of evil that we're fighting. She activated another display, this one showing casualty reports from recent human operations. The numbers were sobering. Humanity was paying a steady price in blood to maintain galactic peace. Every month, we lose people protecting worlds that most of them have never visited. Chen continued. Last week, Lieutenant Commander Jackson died preventing a Vexhai raid on a Confederation colony. He left behind a wife and 2 children he'll never see grow up. Sergeant Martinez was killed disarming a bomb that terrorists had planted in a civilian marketplace on Altair 7. She was 23 years old and had joined the service because she wanted to explore the galaxy. The list went on, each name representing a human who had died far from home in service of people they barely knew. These aren't soldiers who died conquering territory or seizing resources, Chen said quietly. They're guardians who died protecting innocents. And tomorrow, more volunteers will take their places because that's what we do. That's what we are. Veltar struggled to process the implications. Admiral, your people can't sustain these losses indefinitely. Eventually, the cost will become too high. Chen's pale eyes met hers with unwavering certainty. Ambassador, you still don't understand. For my species, there is no cost too high to pay for the protection of the innocent. We've been paying that price for our entire history. The only difference now is that we're paying it for the entire galaxy instead of just our own people. A soft chime announced an incoming communication. Chun accepted the signal, and the familiar figure of Fleet Admiral Zethkara appeared on the display. Admiral Chun, he said, his voice tight with concern. We've received a distress call from the Andromedan Trade Federation. Multiple systems under simultaneous attack by unknown hostiles. Early reports suggest coordinated strikes against civilian populations. Chin's transformation was immediate and complete. The diplomatic representative vanished, replaced by the predatory focus of a military commander. Force composition of the attackers? Unknown. Initial reports are fragmentary, but the attacking vessels don't match any known configuration. This appears to be a first contact scenario, and not a peaceful one. Veltar felt her blood chill. Another unknown species, another potential threat to galactic stability. The cycle was beginning again. I'll scramble the rapid response fleet, Chin said, already moving toward the door. Estimated time to target? 18 hours at maximum burn. Make it 12. And, Admiral, prepare for the possibility that we're dealing with something worse than the Vexhai. As the communication ended, Veltar realized she was witnessing something historic. Without hesitation, without debate or negotiation, humanity was preparing to risk their lives defending people they had never met against an enemy they didn't understand. Admiral, she called as Chun reached the door. Your fleet is still recovering from the last engagement. Many of your ships aren't fully operational. Chun paused, her hand on the door controls. Ambassador, that's never stopped us before. We work with what we have, and we make it enough. But the risks are acceptable, Chin interrupted. Because the alternative is letting innocent people die while we debate the optimal force composition. She turned back to face Veltar, and her expression held the same absolute certainty that had defined humanity's approach to galactic peace. This is what we are, Ambassador. This is our gift to the galaxy. When something threatens the innocent, we respond. We fight. We die if necessary. And we win because the alternative is unacceptable. As Admiral Chun left to prepare for another desperate battle, Veltar remained in the observation lounge, staring out at the joint construction project that represented the future of galactic defense. Human crews worked alongside Confederation engineers, building structures that would serve as bastions of protection for species across the galaxy. The galaxy had asked for help, and humanity had answered. But What they had received wasn't just military assistance. It was permanent adoption by the most dangerous protectors the universe had ever produced. And, as Veltar watched the construction continue, she realized that she was no longer afraid of that protection. She was grateful for it. Because somewhere out in the dark spaces between the stars, new threats were always emerging. But now, for the first time in galactic history, there was a species standing watch, a species that had looked at the vast, hostile universe and had decided that some things were worth protecting at any cost. The age of human guardianship had begun, and the galaxy was finally, truly safe. Through the viewport, she could see human ships already beginning to form up for the journey to Andromedan space. They moved with the same deadly grace she had observed months ago, but now she understood what drove that movement. It wasn't aggression or conquest, it was purpose. These were the children of a death world who had somehow learned to transform their capacity for violence into a force for preservation. They were apex predators who had chosen to hunt only those who threatened the innocent. They were humanity's gift to the stars, and perhaps the galaxy's greatest hope for lasting peace. As the first ships jumped to hyperspace, beginning their race to reach the embattled Andromedan systems, Veltar found herself offering a prayer to whatever forces governed the universe. Not for the safety of the human fleet, they had proven capable of taking care of themselves. Instead, she prayed for the unknown enemy they were about to face. Because they were about to learn what happened when you threatened something that humanity had decided to protect. And that, she knew, was a lesson that very few enemies survived to remember.